think about this. 53 of the first 62 DNA exonerations of people who turned out to be innocent of charges of capital crimes in the United States, 53 of these people were convicted on eyewitness testimony. We know from cognitive social science how unreliable eyewitness testimony is today. Why should we suppose that eyewitness testimony from 33 AD is any more reliable? This, as an argument for God's existence, seems to me to be... and what it leads me to ask is Dr. Craig infallible, or does he just not listen? Probably the latter. He probably doesn't listen to what his interlocutors have suggested. And I don't think that he listens because he's really not interested in getting at the truth. He's interested in scoring debate points. There are two moves that Dr. Craig almost always makes. First, there's the burden of proof claim. As though we were in a court of law, as though it was a question of the defending attorney and the prosecuting attorney engaged in an adversarial procedure. And the other thing that you often hear is, all I need to show to win is. So, for example, at the very end of his remarks, he said, I've got 8 arguments, and he's got to refute all 8 of them, or else I win. You know, philosophy and theology don't proceed by courtroom-style debate. We're engaged in a cooperative search for the truth, both theists and atheists, not an adversarial contest for victory. This is the wrong format for a profitable discussion of faith or God or science and reason. But let's turn to the substance of the matter. Our topic is whether faith in God is reasonable. But of course, by definition, faith is a belief in the absence of evidence. So I'm going to give Dr. Craig the benefit of the doubt and accept the change that he has made in the terms of the debate. It now turns out that what we're arguing about is whether belief in God is reasonable. And the God we're talking about is the God of the Abrahamic religions, the God of Islam, of Christianity, and Judaism. It's not the milk and water deism of, for example, the founding fathers, Jefferson, Adams, Monroe, perhaps even George Washington. The God we're talking about has the following features. If he exists, he's got the 3 omnis and benevolence. He's got omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, and an unqualifiedly good will. If these 4 features are incompatible with some obvious fact, then, of course, the theist's God is non-existent. Can I have some water, Corey? Let's be clear that we're arguing about theism here. And in thinking about theism and in thinking about science, thank you, Corey. There's something else that we had better keep in mind. Dr. Craig is very confident about his take on fundamental physics, on important and controversial questions about which physicists have not attained consensus. But the important thing to bear in mind in thinking about his take, the sides he chose, the confidence with which he presents his take, the important thing to bear in mind is this. There are 2,000 members of the National Academy of Sciences, the most important body of the most distinguished scientists in the United States, of which 4 are faculty here at Purdue, and 2 of the 2 Nobel Prize winners in chemistry, of course, are both members of the National Academy of Science. Of these 2,000 people, 95% of them are atheists, and the percentage for the physicists is even higher. What do these people know about physics that Dr. Craig doesn't know? Is it a coincidence that this number of the members of the National Academy of Science are unbelievers? I think it isn't, and I think it requires us to take with a certain lack of confidence the claims that Dr. Craig makes about science, and I'm going to controvert some of those claims right now. In particular, many of the arguments that Dr. Craig gave tonight, and which he has given repeatedly in the past, rest on the first cause argument, an argument that goes back certainly to St. Thomas Aquinas and probably to Aristotle. And it rests on, of course, the principle of sufficient reason, the principle that everything that exists must have a cause. Now, the remarkable thing about this argument and the principle of sufficient reason, as it's called, on which it rests, is that the principle is plainly false. Okay? It's refuted trillions of times every second throughout the universe. It's refuted in this room, and I'll give you a pretty full explanation of why. Take two uranium-238 atoms, okay, that are absolutely indistinguishable. In a given moment, these two indistinguishable atoms of exactly the same mass and energy state, have the following difference. One produces an alpha particle spontaneously and the other doesn't, and there is no cause whatsoever for that difference. That's what quantum mechanics tells us. Suddenly one emits an alpha particle and the other doesn't, and there's no cause whatever for that difference between them. Now, you might think that that's not a very important fact of nature, but 1 mole, 1 Avogadro's number of uranium-238 molecules emits 3 million alpha particles a second. And every helium atom on this planet is one of those alpha particles. And the smoke detectors that operate all through this auditorium to protect us from fires, those operate because of the indeterminate, unexplained, completely spontaneous appearance of an alpha particle out of a uranium atom in these systems. For Dr. Craig to insist on the arguments that rest on the claim that every event had a cause that had to have brought it into being is just bluff, right? It's not a principle accepted in physics. And you can't argue from its intuitive attractiveness.
Rosenberg is right to question Craig's approach because when we look at the evidence, the first cause idea collapses. Physics has shown us that causality isn't absolute. In quantum mechanics, events like radioactive decay happen without any cause at all. This isn't speculation. It's measured billions of times a second. For example, uranium-238 atoms release alpha particles spontaneously, and we use this in smoke detectors. If Craig were right that everything must have a cause, those detectors simply wouldn't work. And it's not just physics. In cosmology, the leading models of the Big Bang don't point to a personal creator. The Hartle-Hawking no-boundary proposal and inflationary models show that the universe can arise naturally from quantum states without a divine push. Nobel laureate Steven Weinberg put it bluntly, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. Even the Bible admits faith doesn't rest on evidence. Hebrews 11:1 defines it as the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. That's belief in spite of the lack of proof. By contrast, science demands testable evidence, and that's why the National Academy of Sciences reports that over 90% of its members, the very people who study origins in physics, reject belief in God.
Let's consider the fine-tuning argument, another of the claims about science that Dr. Craig makes. This is the argument that the charge on the electron, the gravitational constant, the mass of the electron, Planck's constant, the Hubble constant, the cosmic density parameter, that they're all so beautifully arranged to make human life actual that there must have been some purpose or design that brought them into being in order to do that. That's the best explanation. Well, to begin with, this is terrible carbon chauvinism. If these constants had been slightly different, maybe there would be intelligent life in the universe that's germanium-based or silicon-based. Look at the periodic table of the elements, look at the atoms around carbon in the periodic table, and ask yourself whether, if some of these constants have been slightly different, whether there might not be intelligent creatures in the universe that are differently composed from us. More important, physics ruled out the kind of teleology, the kind of purpose of thinking that Dr. Craig invokes here 400 years ago. And if it's one thing that physics is not going to go back to and turn around and accept in its search for the fundamental nature of reality, it's the invocation of purposes. There are, of course, in physical theory at least two different ways in which the particular way in which the constants of our part of the universe could have come into existence, while there being an indefinitely large number of other combinations of constants making up other inaccessible regions, either of this universe or of other universes. So the inflationary period soon after the Big Bang produced regions of space by completely quantum mechanical indeterministic symmetry breaking, right, which are inaccessible to us, which are beyond our horizon, our event horizon. And there are possibly indefinitely many of these, okay? And for all we know, there may be life or there may not be life in them. And then, of course, string theory and M theory tell us that there are minimally 10 to the 500th different kinds of possible universes or actual universes bubbling up out of the quantum foam of the eternally existing multi-universe. I'm not going to take sides on these varying theories, but I defy Professor Craig to argue from authority that it is impossible for something to have been created from nothing. The symmetry breaking, which is characteristic of the cascade of events that occurred in our universe and which produces our universe in addition to the indefinitely many other universes bubbling up out of the quantum foam of the multiverse, that symmetry breaking is another example of the violation of the principle of sufficient reason on which Dr. Craig stakes so many of his arguments. Let's turn to something much more accessible, objective values. Now, Dr. Craig's argument that only God can underwrite objective values was refuted by Plato in 390 BC in an argument that he gives in the first and the simplest of his dialogues, the Euthyphro. I'm very tempted to say to Dr. Craig, what part of no Euthyphro don't you understand? The question that Plato raises in the Euthyphro goes like this: take your favorite moral norm. Gay marriage is forbidden, or FGM is required, or thou shalt not kill. Take your favorite moral norm. Ask yourself this question: is it morally right because God chose it? Or did God choose it because it's morally right? We all know the answer to this question. The answer to this question is God chose it because it's morally right. And what that means, of course, is that the moral rightness of thou shalt not kill is entirely independent fact from God's choosing it. It's because he recognized the moral rightness of thou shalt not kill that he imposed it on us. And that means that the mere fact that it's God who imposed it on us doesn't explain the nature of objective value. It's that further fact that he was wise enough and smart enough to detect about thou shalt not kill that made it the morally right value for us. Okay? And this is a point that Socrates makes to Euthyphro in the first and simplest of the dialogues. And it is a problem that theological ethics has wrestled with ever since. The only option in responding to this argument is the divine command theory, a theory that has had its exponents all the way back to William of Ockham. And the trouble with divine command theory is that in order to articulate that theory, in order to defend it, in order to make it sound plausible, you have to already commit yourself to there being some normative fact, some moral fact about the moral rules that make them right, independent of God saying, you do it or you go to hell. Okay? There's a rightness about moral norms that cannot be exhausted by the mere fact that it was handed down on the mountain by Moses from God. Now, natural selection is a theory, of course, about how we came to be moral, why we're moral, about what the ecological conditions are that made us moral. It explains our morality, but it doesn't necessarily explain away our morality. That requires something else, okay? And the suggestion that without God, the naturalist, the Darwinian, has no basis on which to underwrite his normative commitment, that again is bluff, and in fact, it's the person who claims that it's God that gave normative morality to us, that explains its normative rightness, is the the person who has, regrettably to use the expression that Dr. Craig so invokes, the burden of proof of explaining what is it about God that makes for the moral rightness of the ethical norms that he imposes on us. And there are, of course, any number of alternative ethical theories that underwrite the objectivity of ethics, among them utilitarianism and social contract theory and ideal observer theory, and Hume's theory of the sympathies, and the Kantian theory of the categorical imperative. And the real problem for Dr. Craig is he needs to refute each of these normative theories in order to show that there's no other basis for ethics than God, and the resources that he would use to cast doubt on these theories also cast doubt on the divine command theory. So, let's turn to the argument from the New Testament. I am sort of gobsmacked as a philosopher that he should persist in propounding this preposterous argument. Ask yourself the following question. In 1827, Joseph Smith got 11 people to certify that they observed the golden tablets, which he, an illiterate person, was able to translate from Reform Egyptian, okay, and convey the Book of Mormon to the Latter-day Saints. Do we believe, on the basis of those 11 certificates that are only about 160 years old, that the Book of Mormon is the revealed Word of God? The Quran tells us that Muhammad ascended to heaven from the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, on the 26th of February, 621. And there are millions and millions of Muslims all over the world who are committed to that great truth. Do you think we in this room should believe it? Right? Scientology, that claims 8 million adherents throughout the world, Scientology tells us that 75 million years ago, somebody named Zeno brought billions of people to Earth on spaceships that looked like DC-8s. And who are we to believe that there are 55,000 people in the United States or 8 million people around the world who really believe this too? Is there any reason why we should accept the certification of L. Ron Hubbard and the Church of Scientology that this actually happened? No, of course not. How many of you are familiar with the statues of Madonna taken out from their churches once a year which shed tears? Of course, as scientists, we know exactly what the physical properties are of these statues and how the rapid and sudden change of temperature between the inside and the outside of the cathedral produces condensation, which the devout believe to be tears. But that's no reason for us to believe it. Think about this. 53 of the first 62 DNA exonerations of people who turned out to be innocent of charges of capital crimes in the United States, 53 of these people were convicted on eyewitness testimony. We know from cognitive social science how unreliable eyewitness testimony is today. Why should we suppose that eyewitness testimony from 33 AD is any more reliable? This, as an argument for God's existence, seems to me to be...
The fine-tuning argument sounds impressive until you understand how selection bias and modern physics dismantle it. The fact that constants like gravity and the electron's charge allow life as we know it doesn't prove design. It proves we're alive to observe it. That's the anthropic principle, not divine intention. Rosenberg's right. This is carbon chauvinism. Life may be carbon-based here, but silicon, boron, or other elements could support life under different physical laws. The assumption that only Earth-like life is possible ignores chemistry, exoplanet research, and astrobiology. Even NASA's Astrobiology Institute explores non-carbon life scenarios in radically different environments, like Titan's methane lakes. As for the multiverse, it's not science fiction. It's a logical consequence of inflationary cosmology and string theory, both supported by empirical math and predictive models. Stanford physicist Andre Lund and Nobel laureate Alan Guth show how symmetry breaking after the Big Bang could produce millions of pocket universes, each with different constants. We exist in one that supports life. Then there's morality. The idea that objective moral values require God has been debunked since Plato's Euthyphro dilemma in 399 BC. If God commands morality, then genocide or slavery would be good if God willed it. If God recognizes good, then goodness exists independently of him, making God unnecessary for morality. Today, evolutionary biology explains how moral behavior evolved. Altruism, fairness, and empathy help social species thrive. It's game theory, not divine decree. Studies by Franz de Waal show that even chimpanzees have a sense of justice and compassion. So morality isn't uniquely human, much less uniquely Christian. And Christianity's so-called evidence? Ancient eyewitness claims. But cognitive science and criminal law confirm eyewitnesses are terribly unreliable. The Innocence Project found that 70% of DNA exoneration cases were caused by false eyewitness testimony. So why trust oral traditions from 2,000 years ago over modern evidence?
I noticed that in Dr. Rosenberg's opening speech, he didn't really present many arguments against the reasonableness of belief in God. He gestured in the direction of the problem of evil, but he didn't really develop it. The problem is that that argument is based upon controversial premises, such as that if God is all-powerful, he can just create any world that he wants, and that if God is all good, he would want to create a world without evil. And neither one of those is necessarily true, and that is why among philosophers, even atheists, the logical version of the problem of evil is widely rejected. So what Dr. Rosenberg needs to show is that it is impossible that God could have morally sufficient reasons for permitting the suffering in the world, and until he does that, he hasn't even begun to offer a problem of evil that disproves theism. Rather, when you read Dr. Rosenberg's work, what you discover is that his skepticism about God's existence is really rooted in his scientism or naturalism, which make it unreasonable to believe in God. But here I think it's absolutely crucial that we distinguish between two types of naturalism that Dr. Rosenberg tends to blur together. Epistemological naturalism, which says that science is the only source of knowledge, and metaphysical naturalism, which says that only physical things exist. Let me say a word about each one of these. First, with respect to epistemological naturalism, I want to make 2 points. First, it's a false theory of knowledge for 2 reasons. First, it's overly restrictive. There are truths that cannot be proven by natural science, and the success of natural science in discovering truths about the physical world does nothing to show that it's the only source of knowledge and truth. Secondly, it's self-refuting. The statement, natural science is the only source of knowledge, is not itself a scientific statement, and therefore it cannot be true. For these 2 reasons, epistemological naturalism is a false theory of knowledge that is widely rejected by philosophers. But leave that point aside. The really important point for tonight's debate is the second, that epistemological naturalism does not imply metaphysical naturalism. A case in point would be Willard Quine, the most famous epistemological naturalist of the 20th century. Quine showed himself to be commendably open to the reality of non-physical entities. He wrote, "If I saw indirect explanatory benefit in positing possibilia, spirits, a creator, I would joyfully accord them scientific status too, on a par with such avowedly scientific posits as quarks and black holes." And in fact, Quine was as good as his word, for he did posit the existence of immaterial, non-physical objects, namely mathematical objects like sets. Quine's case shows that the epistemological naturalist need not be a metaphysical naturalist. But secondly, my arguments for the existence of God. Many of my arguments do just what Quine said. They show, on the basis of scientific evidence, the explanatory benefit of positing God. and so they are acceptable to the epistemological naturalist. The epistemological naturalist can, and I think should be, a theist. So the real issue in the debate tonight is not epistemological, but metaphysical naturalism. And Dr. Rosenberg hasn't given us any reason to think that metaphysical naturalism is true. So, what can we say about metaphysical naturalism? Well, again, I want to make 2 points. First, my arguments for the existence of God show that metaphysical naturalism is not true. There is a personal, transcendent reality beyond the physical universe. But secondly, I think that metaphysical naturalism is so contrary to reason and experience as to be absurd. And in the following arguments, the first premise in every case is taken from Dr. Rosenberg's own book. So, first, the argument from intentionality. According to Dr. Rosenberg, if naturalism is true, I cannot think about anything. That's because there are no intentional states. But 2, I am thinking about naturalism, from which it follows 3, therefore, naturalism is not true. So if you think that you ever think about anything, you should conclude that naturalism is false. Second, the argument from meaning. According to Dr. Rosenberg, if naturalism is true, no sentence has any meaning. And he says that all the sentences in his own book are in fact meaningless. But premise 2, premise 1 has meaning. We all understood it. And therefore it follows that 3, naturalism is not true. Third, argument from truth. According to Dr. Rosenberg, if naturalism is true, there are no true sentences. And that's because they're all meaningless. But 2, premise 1 is true. That's what the naturalist believes and asserts, from which it follows 3, therefore naturalism is not true. Fourth, the argument from moral praise and blame. According to Dr. Rosenberg, if naturalism is true, then I am not morally praiseworthy or blameworthy for any of my actions, because, as I said, on his view, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But 2, I am morally praiseworthy and blameworthy for at least some of my actions. If you think that you've ever done something truly wrong or truly good, then you should conclude that 3, therefore, naturalism is not true. Fifth, the argument from freedom. According to Dr. Rosenberg, if naturalism is true, I do not do anything freely. Everything is determined. But 2, I can freely agree or disagree with premise 1, from which it follows 3, therefore, naturalism is not true. Sixth, the argument from purpose. According to Dr. Rosenberg, if naturalism is true, I do not plan to do anything. But 2, I planned to come to tonight's debate. That's why I'm here. From which it follows 3, therefore naturalism is not true. Seventh, the argument from enduring. According to Dr. Rosenberg, if naturalism is true, I do not endure for 2 moments of time. But 2, I have been sitting here for more than a minute. If you think that you're the same person who walked into the room tonight, then you should agree that 3, therefore naturalism is not true. And finally, the argument from personal existence. This is perhaps the coup de grace against naturalism. According to Dr. Rosenberg, if naturalism is true, I do not exist. He says there are no selves, there are no persons, no first-person perspectives. But 2, I do exist. I know this as certainly as I know anything, from which it follows, therefore, naturalism is not true. In a word, metaphysical naturalism is absurd. And notice that my argument is not that it is unappealing. Rather, it is that metaphysical naturalism flies in the face of reason and experience and is therefore untenable.
Craig's argument collapses when you look at what we actually know. The claim that science can't explain thought or morality ignores decades of research. Neuroscience shows that thinking, planning, and moral decisions all correlate with specific regions of the brain. When those areas are damaged, personality and moral judgment change. That would be impossible if the mind were immaterial. Consciousness doesn't require a soul. It requires a functioning brain. Morality doesn't depend on God either. Evolutionary biology explains cooperation, empathy, and fairness as traits that helped our ancestors survive in groups. We see these same behaviors in primates, elephants, even rats. Moral instincts are biological, not divine commands. The idea that God is the source of objective morality also contradicts Scripture. The Bible includes laws that permit slavery, genocide, and treating women and children as property. If morality comes from God, then we're forced to defend the indefensible. But if morality is independent of God, as even Plato argued 2,400 years ago, then we don't need a deity to justify right and wrong. As for existence, meaning, or purpose, we don't need a supernatural explanation to find value in our lives. The universe doesn't owe us meaning. We create it through relationships, curiosity, and action. There's more honesty and courage in accepting the universe as it is, complex, indifferent, but full of potential, than in clinging to a story that demands blind faith. So ask yourself, if we have science to explain nature, evolution to explain morality, and reason to guide our choices, what exactly is God still doing in the picture? Let us know what you think in the comments. Like and subscribe if you want more content like this, and keep questioning everything, especially the ideas we're told never to question.
Lots of Christians in America feel Christianity is under attack and that Christians deserve special rights, including tax dollars to support private Christian schools. They want to require prayer in schools and sex education classes to teach abstinence only. Some have convinced states to pass anti-gay, anti-transgender, and anti-abortion bills.
I take the view that religious communities make a very significant contribution to our society. Not, and I would say we no longer, despite trappings, live in Christian societies in the West. Christianity in many ways has been discentered, which I would say is a good thing, but it has to move itself away from its position of privilege at the head of the table to take its place in a broader community.
Mixing politics with religion is fraught with danger. We all know theocracies where leaders governed by the will of an infallible God. Openly defying the correct faith is called blasphemy and leads to harsh punishments, even death. I think everyone should have the right to practice any religion or none, as long as they don't force their beliefs on others. I appreciate people whose religion inspires them to work on important social justice issues. In countries that are not theocratic, politics might still be infused with religion. My country, the United States, has a secular government with a problem of religion immersed in politics. I hold in my hand a godless document. It's the United States Constitution. Our framers established the first nation in history meant to separate religion and government. Authority rests with we the people, the first three words of the Constitution, not without the deity. The only mentions of religion in the Constitution are exclusionary. The First Amendment prohibits the U.S. Congress from making laws respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Article 6 prohibits religious tests for public office. That didn't stop some states from putting religious requirements in their state constitutions, including my state. I was a candidate for governor of South Carolina in 1990 to challenge the provision of my state constitution that bars atheists from holding public office. After an 8-year legal battle, I won a unanimous decision in the South Carolina Supreme Court, striking down this unconstitutional religious test requirement. The U.S. Declaration of Independence, which is not a governing document, does refer to a creator endowing people with unalienable rights. The Declaration was a call for rebellion against the British Crown to distinguish us from an empire that asserted the divine right of kings. Our founders were products of the Enlightenment, looking toward reason and evidence from the natural world. Many were deists, referring to nature's God, who set the laws of nature in motion and then retired as deity emeritus. Had they known about evolution and modern science, many would likely have been atheists. In 1954, American President Dwight Eisenhower signed into law the addition of the words "under God" to our Pledge of Allegiance to distinguish us from godless communists. This turned our secular pledge, recited daily by students, into a religious pledge. America is one nation under the Constitution, or maybe under Canada, but we're not one nation under God. Similarly, "In God We Trust" became our controversial national motto in 1956 at the height of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, replacing the more inclusive motto "E pluribus unum," Latin for "out of many, one." The Ten Commandments are another divisive issue. Many Americans who want them displayed in schools and courts either don't realize or don't care that the first commandment, "Thou shalt have no other gods," conflicts with the First Amendment, which guarantees the freedom to worship one, many, or no gods. Churches and individuals are certainly free to post the Ten Commandments openly, just not on government buildings. In 2016, Donald Trump became president in large part because of overwhelming support of white Christian evangelicals. Many are also white Christian nationalists who long for the olden days when their white privilege enabled them more easily to discriminate against those of a different race and those with non-Christian or no religious beliefs. These white Christian nationalists are trying to rewrite American history, claiming that the U.S. was formed as a Christian nation.
Religion and politics have always been a dangerous mix. History shows that when governments claim divine authority, reason and human rights disappear. During Europe's Middle Ages, questioning the church could mean torture or death. The same pattern appears in modern theocracies like Iran or Saudi Arabia, where laws come from religion, not evidence or human equality. Silverman is right that America's founders built a different model. The Constitution never mentions God. It gives power to the people, not to priests or kings. The founders came out of the Enlightenment, when thinkers like John Locke and Voltaire argued that morality and law should come from reason and experience, not revelation. Science has shown that natural processes, not divine intervention, explain life and the universe. Evolution, proven through genetics and fossils, replaced the old creation story. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old, not a few thousand. No credible evidence shows a supernatural force guiding nations or politics.
On January 6, 2021, we learned just how fragile my country's democracy could be, as Donald Trump incited a mob of terrorists to storm our nation's capital in an attempt to overturn the 2020 presidential election. Many were inspired by their white Christian nationalism. Lots of Christians in America feel Christianity is under attack and that Christians deserve special rights, including tax dollars to support private Christian schools. They want to require prayer in schools and sex education classes to teach abstinence only. Some have convinced states to pass anti-gay, anti-transgender, and anti-abortion bills. Some also promote unscientific religious teachings like creationism in secular schools. Christians have a lot of influence over the U.S. government. The Republican Party succeeded in packing our Supreme Court with conservative Christian justices who in June will vote to overturn Roe v. Wade, a 1973 decision that legalized abortion everywhere in the U.S. Looking at countries around the world shows that religion and politics can make a terrible partnership, and when mixing the two, we often get the worst of both. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Professor Kaur?
Thank you. I think I'd like to take a slightly different approach in the topic of religion and politics. So I'm speaking from the Sikh perspective, both in my academic capacity, but also from personal experience. And I think when considering this topic, it's important to take into consideration lived experience. So I'm an anthropologist by background. And what I'd really like to do is to focus on actually the understanding of what we mean when we say religion, what we mean when we say politics. So what we say in the Sikh faith is that there is not a separation of these two domains. It comes down to a fundamental understanding of what we define religion as, what we define politics as, and we don't see these as kind of conflicting domains in the Sikh faith itself. So I really want to draw attention to the way that we understand these concepts. So for example, in the Sikh faith, there is no term specifically for secular. So in the spoken language, there is no term for secular, there is no term for religion. We talk about dharam, which is this all-encompassing worldview. And so within that, all of these thoughts, mindsets, and beliefs are part of that. And when we talk about a divine or a god, we don't mean this very kind of Abrahamic definition of a god, and so this does not permeate the way that Sikhs practice and believe their faith. So I don't see this as being a fundamental issue for Sikhs in the way that they practice. Having said that, religion and politics have taken a more academic approach in general discourse, and what that means to say is that then they are set up as these two dichotomous realms. But what I want to go back to is where I started, this lived experience. How does that work for people in practice? How does that work for politicians? How does that work for religious scholars? When we talk about politics, are we talking about politics with a small p or a capital P? How are we defining these terms? How are we actually implementing these terms? And I think I'm going to leave my reflection quite short because I think it's more interesting if we engage in a bit of conversation.
What happened on January 6th showed how religion can twist politics into something dangerous. People stormed the U.S. Capitol shouting prayers, holding crosses, and claiming they were defending God's country. That wasn't faith. That was fanaticism. It's what happens when people start believing their political side speaks for God. Studies after the attack confirmed it. The Public Religion Research Institute found that the strongest predictor of sympathy for the rioters wasn't party affiliation. It was Christian nationalism, the belief that America was chosen by God and should be ruled by Christian law. That mindset doesn't protect freedom. It destroys it. We're now seeing laws shaped by that same thinking. Bans on abortion, attacks on LGBTQ+ rights, and science being replaced with dogma in classrooms. The data is clear. Abstinence-only education doesn't work, and teaching creationism isn't education, it's indoctrination. Yet billions of tax dollars still fund religious schools pushing those views. The truth is, when government bends to religion, everyone loses. Believers and non-believers alike. The founders built a secular nation for a reason, to protect us from this exact kind of moral dictatorship. Faith should guide personal life, not public policy. Because once religion controls politics, reason stops leading the way.
Thank you very much, Professor Gordon.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I am by training a historian of the early modern period with a particular interest in the Reformation, and just to pick up on some of the comments already, it likewise is a world in which politics and religion cannot be separated, and it certainly wasn't in their mind. And one of the things that I think is significant about the Reformation was that it brought a new way of thinking about the relationship between the temporal powers, spiritual powers, and the way in which the Reformation was in itself inherently not only political, in the sense that the reformers decided very early on that what had to happen was that if there was to be any chance of success, the reform of Christianity had to be tied to political authority. So right from its inception, the Protestant Reformation was inherently political. But what they understood by this political was the kind of the coterminous that the body of the faithful of the church was that of the state. But very quickly, and I'll just make a broad story very short, it became a movement that in many ways ate its own principles, that the Protestant churches, having emerged as a movement of rebellion, as resistance against medieval Catholicism, very quickly instituted itself and began to practice very much many of the things in which it had reacted. Violence, it was putting persecution, it was putting dissent to dissenters to death very quickly after the implementation of the Reformation. So this is a subject that interests me very much as a historian of the pre-modern world, is the very sort of fluid relationship between religion and politics, and what have been some of the consequences of that, particularly through the Reformation, the growth of religious diversity, the fragmentation of the Reformation into many different religious movements, which created questions of coexistence. How do you deal with difference in terms of religion within political bodies? This is, by the 17th century, is a central question. Starts to raise issues of toleration. John Locke and some of the early thinkers about this. I'm not saying there's a linear development, but these are the questions of religion and pluralism are very important. And I think that's actually a helpful thing for us to reflect on in our contemporary discussions. I am a practicing Christian of the Reformed tradition, a kind of progressive perspective that sees very much engagement in the world in terms of, and some of the things that have already been mentioned, social reform, social justice, questions that are very important to us. I take the view that religious communities make a very significant contribution to our society. Not, and I would say we no longer, just by trappings, live in Christian societies in the West. Christianity in many ways has been discentered, which I would say is a good thing, but it has to move itself away from a position of privilege at the head of the table to take its place in a broader community of religious communities and non-religious communities, in offering something which I think can make a significant contribution to our society. Not from, as I say, a place of domination, of privilege or power, but as communities who are actively engaged in a whole range of activities that are of enormous social benefit. So I'm very keen to engage in this conversation in ways in which I think religious communities make a significant contribution to society.
Thank you very much, Professor Gordon. Last but not least, Dr. Freud-Candel.
Thank you. It's lovely to have Locke and tolerance referenced, because my interest in this topic is primarily in terms of my background is in theology and the study in particular of the Jewish community in Britain and the pathways of resettlement that the Jewish community has navigated, in which undoubtedly the role of tolerance as a central defining principle in the British political system played an incredibly important role in the different ways, the different pathways in which Jews found a place within British society. Having said that, my particular interest in examining that journey of the Jewish community in Britain entails understanding and examining the influence that an established church has precisely had on the opportunities that minority religious groups were able to enjoy in a British context. And there, as I say, the influence of Lockean toleration in combination with the role of an established church in the way in which it played out in an English context, was incredibly important, on the one hand, in a very positive way, in enabling Jews in Britain, in a very notable contrast to the experiences of Jews, for example, in continental Europe, from having to undergo a process of having to explain away and their role, their acceptability within British society. The notion of tolerance in an established society in Britain meant that Jews in a British context were discriminated against in terms of being non-Anglican, but they were not discriminated against as Jews per se, and that significantly altered their experience. But having said that this was a positive on some level, there is a flip side to that. And Bill Williams is a social historian who coined the term the anti-Semitism of tolerance to characterize the Jewish experience in Britain. What does that mean? It means that the whole premise of tolerance is that there is one correct view, and that is Anglicanism in an English context. But within the parameters of that notion of tolerance, there is an acceptance of alternative views, albeit while not accepting them as fully ideal. So this anti-Semitism of tolerance impacts on the way in which the Jewish experience developed, leading the Jewish community in Britain precisely to construct institutions which in many ways can be seen to seek to offer parallels to the Church of England, because that was the way in which Jews in Britain felt that they had to seek to find a pathway to being fully accepted. And so that's why we see the emergence of centralized institutions as critical to the formation of the Jewish community in Britain, often at the expense of creativity within the community, because the emphasis is on creating umbrella bodies that can provide parallels to Anglican structures. But by creating these umbrella bodies, you focus on that which everyone shares, rather than creating a space in which to articulate alternative voices. And so those are my sort of primary interests in terms of the interrelationships between church and state, religion and politics, the way in which on the one hand it can be incredibly beneficial, but on the other hand in terms of the very severe challenges it poses. But I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Professor Gordon reminded us that the Reformation started as a rebellion against religious power, but quickly became another form of control. That cycle of faith movements rising against oppression only to become oppressive themselves is a pattern we've seen for centuries. Once religion and politics merge, power corrupts both. The church used to burn heretics. Now it simply legislates morality. The method changed, but the mindset didn't. Even Gordon admits that Christianity in the West has lost its privileged seat at the table, and that's progress. True equality begins when no faith claims authority over others. Religion can still do good, but only when it operates from compassion, not dominance. Dr. Freud Kandel's analysis of tolerance in Britain reveals the same tension. Tolerance sounds fair, but as she explained, it was really permission granted by those in power, an acceptance that still implied inferiority. Jews were allowed to exist, not to belong. That's not equality, that's control dressed up as kindness. History shows that mixing religion with politics always creates insiders and outsiders. The only lasting solution is a secular one, where belief is personal and the law belongs to everyone equally. So here's the question. In a world still divided by belief, can we finally build societies that value truth and empathy over ancient authority? If you found this discussion thought-provoking, hit like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more deep dives into religion, history, and reason.